We do have time for at least a few, if not several, questions. I appreciate the two main themes of your presentation, and at the risk of taking you into another topic, I am curious about the assertion that the low interest rate environment that monetary policy has created has really exacerbated the economic inequality issue, in that those with resources to invest are now investing in the stock market because it's the only place they can get a return. And now economic inequality is the big political debate on the scene in Washington. How do you react to that? What are your observations about that?
Yeah,
and I think you need...
Do I need that or not? I have a lapel mic. I think, can people hear me? Okay. So this is an excellent question, and I'll answer it in two pieces. So the first thing to say is that monetary policy does have distributional consequences, and we're very aware of that. But ultimately, monetary policy is about our objectives, our goals, and doing what we can to achieve the goals that have been set for us by Congress. So whatever the distributional consequences might be, we're charged with doing what we can to facilitate a rapid return to 2% inflation and a rapid return to maximum employment. Having said all that, I mean, I think that monetary policy has been very helpful during this period in facilitating more rapid recovery than we would have seen otherwise. I've emphasized how slow the recovery's been, but without the actions that have been taken, and they've been extraordinary actions, I do think the pace of recovery would have been slower. I think we would have seen higher unemployment rates. We'd have seen more long-term unemployment, and I think that would have been caused even more inequality than we've seen. Actually, our annual report essay that came out of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis a couple of weeks ago is on exactly this topic, on inequality. And not taking any stands on any of the issues, because the Fed is always neutral on these kinds of matters, but more trying to lay out some of the facts so that people know what they're talking about when they talk about inequality. I encourage you all to read it. I think it's very fascinating.
We do have a question over here. Identify yourself quickly and then pose your question.
Hi, it's Pat Williams. I'm interested in what are the ways that the Fed, specific ways that the Fed would try to increase inflation, hit those inflation targets you talked about, and then how would that relate to the debt problems?
So in terms of the how would you go about? Basically, if you're trying to achieve a higher inflation rate, the way you do that is by providing more stimulus than you would otherwise. If you want to target an inflation rate of 2% after 2018, that says something about how much stimulus, how low interest rates would be. So this would be saying that the rate of increase in interest rates would be even slower than you would expect, than you would typically expect to get to 2% inflation. You would raise them even more slowly in order to have further stimulus. I haven't thought through the impact on the debt in general. Having higher inflation than was targeted, I think it really depends on what time frame you're talking about. If you're talking about over a very long time frame, we're basically trying to get prices back to where they were supposed to be. And so it's really a wash in terms of the debt. That's really what we're trying to achieve, is actually make that nominal debt that people are borrowing in, make it safe in real terms, so that they know what those dollars mean in terms of the goods and services they can buy.
A question over here off to my left. Identify yourself quickly and then pose your question.
Craig Wildfang, Robbins, Kaplan, Miller, and Cerisi. Doctor, the Congress is not generally associated with making optimal economic decisions, and I wonder what the economic evidence says that proves that 2% is the proper inflation target, and what would it be if it was 3%?
I think it's a good question. I think that the arguments for 2% inflation really go back to the 90s. And there are trade-offs between two forces. One is that higher inflation is generally associated with worse economic outcomes. So if you have high enough inflation, that's going to lead to poor economic outcomes, and that's a correlation you can see in cross-country evidence. On the other hand, the downside of keeping inflation low is that also implies that interest rates will be low, and you're more likely then to run into the problem we just are running into. The fact that we're at the zero lower bound, and it's very hard for us to provide stimulus to the economy when we're at the zero lower bound. So let me back up and explain what I mean by that. Typically, the way you would try to facilitate a more rapid recovery in unemployment and inflation back to target after a recession is by lowering interest rates. But once you hit zero, it's hard to go much lower than that. And so the way to avoid that is to the way to avoid that is to have a higher long-term inflation rate, because that pushes up on long-term interest rates as well. So that's a trade-off that people wrestled with in the 90s, and they came up with a conclusion of 2% inflation. 3% inflation is more costly because it incurs these higher costs associated with inflation. On the other hand, it would help you with that zero lower bound problem, and that would be something you'd have to talk. That's the trade-offs between those two things end up being, I think, model specific, and it would depend on the details of your analysis.
Question here,
Brown
David?
shoe. And I hope I can do this. I have a two-part question. One is there's often a discussion around the basket of goods that are considered in the inflationary cycle measurement, whether those are the right basket and whether they've changed. And then the next one is that we have a massive number of people who are moving from the workforce on a natural basis into the retirement force. And because they're moving into that retirement force, they're depending on either savings or the government for income. That income is being frozen because there's no earnings on their retirement dollars. Is therefore our policy of low interest rates not affecting our recovery and slowing it down because approximately 1/3 of the population's income is frozen?
So let me talk about both those things. Actually, if I could have the slides back, it would be great. I can answer the second question though without the slides. So the second question is about the impact on savers, and so we want to be careful about what we mean by savers when we talk about this. It's really talking about people who have to roll over money from one investment to another, right? Because, in fact, if you have a long-term, you say in 2007, you were the owner of an annuity. It's paying off over a long period of time. The fact that inflation's been as low as it has, you've actually won out compared to what you would have expected in 2007. The stock market being as high as it is, actually for a lot of people who are also, people wear different hats in the financial life. So some of them are, some people who are, when they come to roll over their money, they also have lots of money in the stock market at the same time. So the appreciation in the stock market since March of 2009 has actually been beneficial for them. So we have to be careful about just saying, savers have been hurt. It's actually pretty nuanced and complicated to try to figure out what's happened. With all that said, on balance, the incentive forces associated with low interest rates push in the direction. There's been a lot of work on this. We feel very confident saying the incentive forces of low interest rates are to generate a force where say people spend now, not later. And that's what policy is about. And the reason we want to do that is to facilitate a more rapid return of inflation and employment to our desired goals. Now, let me talk about the second question you raised, or the first question you raised, actually, David, which is about what inflation rate do we look at. So the inflation rate we target includes all goods and services. It includes, in particular, includes food and energy goods. So we're not leaving those out. When we say we're targeting 2% inflation, everything is in there. Sometimes you'll hear central bankers talk about core inflation, And the reason they talk about it is because our tools operate with a lag. And so we have to try to figure out where inflation is going to be, not where it is today. This is not an easy thing to do. So if you look at the middle of 2008 in this picture, you'll see the inflation rate is 4%. Now this is the inflation rate including everything, all goods and services. Why is it 4%? It's because the price of oil is zooming upwards in the first part of 2008. If you had said to yourself at that point, well, boy, it looks like inflation is going to be high for a long period to come, you would have been really wrong. In fact, you see inflation collapsing at this point. And this is why people strip out energy goods and food goods, is because they're so volatile and they're not as informative as they should be about where inflation is going to be going down the road. So we use core as a way to tell us where the variable we're interested in, inflation for everything, is going to be going. And so that's why you'll hear central bankers talk about core inflation.
We have another question over on this side of the room.
Ed Bach, for over almost 100 years, your primary objective was stability, monetary stability. Now you have a second objective, and that's employment. Might that not cause you to have to compromise on some of the decisions that you make on a monetary side, and is that a good thing?
So I've given speeches about this. You know, if you have two objectives, in principle, you do have the potential for a conflict. And it's worth thinking about what that means. It's an intellectual question. It's an academic question, because that's not the problem we face right now. Inflation is low, employment is low. So really our forecast for both those variables is low relative to where we would like them to be for our country. So doing the right thing with respect to employment is doing the right thing with respect to prices. Doing the right thing with respect to prices is doing the right thing with respect to employment. And typically, the kinds of shocks the economy is usually hit by, we do expect those goals to typically be complementary. Having said that, there may well be circumstances, and we're not in them right now, but there may well be circumstances at times where you do face a conflict. And that's really, I would say, above my pay grade. That's Congress's goal, decision to set those objectives for us. I personally think I like the dual mandate because the fact that if you look around the central banks around the world, many of them have only one objective: inflation. Keep inflation at 2% or whatever their target rate is. But there are always caveats written in about we're watching the real economy to make sure we're not doing too much damage to it. And so even if they have a target of 2%, they're taking into account what's going on in the real economy. Congress, I think, has been wise to say to you, let's be explicit about that. You're going to be watching the real economy anyways. Let's tell the American people that's what you're doing. So I think of that as a more honest approach to monetary policy. But it's absolutely up to Congress. If Congress says target prices, price stability is our only goal, that's up to them.
Well, we have to wrap this up if we're going to keep on schedule, which is our tradition. I suppose both Mark and I could be flattered that you actually gave Congress some credit for getting something right. But I think I can speak for both of us in saying that throughout our congressional tenure, we were constantly hearing from people that we needed to get rid of the Federal Reserve. Think of 535 members of Congress trying to make these decisions. So I think we can credit a Congress of 100 years ago for setting up the Federal Reserve, and I think you gave us ample evidence today as to what a wise move that was. So thank you so much. Here's your paperweight. Since you're an annual speaker, this is probably going in your trophy case, along with the other paperweights we've given you, but help me thank our guest speaker.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.